Put up the barricade. He's not authorized to be here.
That's what she told the two men in reflective vests on a June morning, while they dragged orange traffic drums across the south approach of a bridge that sits on my property. Karen Delancey stood behind them with her arms crossed and a walkie-talkie clipped to her belt like she was directing traffic at a military checkpoint. I was in my truck, on my own gravel road, 100 yards from the bridge I legally owned. I rolled down my window, took 3 photographs, rolled the window back up, and reversed out slowly. I didn't say a word. 3 months later, I walked into a packed community center with a projector, a structural engineer, a fire chief, and a 1997 newsletter that the HOA had published themselves, and I watched 89 hands go up to accept an easement deal that ended Karen Delancey's presidency on the spot. Would you have gotten out of the truck that morning, or let her build her own case? Tell me in the comments. Let me give you the full picture, because this story doesn't work without the background. My name is Mitchell Holloway. I'm 58 years old. I spent 30 years as a structural engineer, specializing in transportation infrastructure, bridges, overpasses, culverts, load-bearing retaining walls. I worked for a consulting firm out of Knoxville that held contracts with the Tennessee Department of Transportation, and I personally inspected or signed off on more than 400 bridges across the eastern half of the state. I know bridges the way a cardiac surgeon knows hearts. Every material, every stress point, every way they fail. I retired early, not by choice exactly. My daughter Ellie was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis at 29. She was a veterinarian in Chattanooga, sharp and stubborn and full of plans, and the diagnosis took the floor out from under all of them. I moved closer to help. I cut my hours, then cut them again. Eventually, the firm and I agreed it was time. I was 55 and suddenly had more silence in my life than I knew what to do with. I started looking at land the way other men start looking at boats, as something big and quiet and far away from everything that hurts. My friend Don Shepard, a real estate attorney I'd worked with on right-of-way acquisitions for 20 years, called me one evening and said he'd found something worth looking at. A timber company called Ridgeview Forestry was liquidating its holdings in rural McMinn County, East Tennessee. They had a 2,400-acre parcel on the south bank of Tanner Creek, mixed hardwood forest, creek frontage, old logging roads, and a ridge with a 3-county view that would stop your heart. The timber had been selectively harvested over decades, so the canopy was still dense. The company was underwater on a loan and needed to move fast. I paid $620,000. Title was clean. The deed description ran 31 pages. I read every one of them because that's what I do. Now here's the piece that changes everything. In 1952, the original owner of the parcel, a man named Howard Tanner, whose family had logged that ridge since before the Civil War, built a steel truss bridge across Tanner Creek to connect his timberland with the county road on the north bank. He needed it for equipment access. He poured the abutments himself, hired a crew out of Athens to fabricate the steel, and laid a timber deck that he replaced twice over the next 30 years. That bridge sat at the southeastern corner of the Tanner parcel, right where the creek narrowed between 2 limestone bluffs. In 1987, a developer named Paul Winstead purchased 140 acres on the north side of the creek, elevated land with gentle slopes and mature oaks, accessible only by crossing the bridge from the county road on the south side. He platted it as Briarstone Ridge Estates, a gated community of 112 lots. He paved the bridge approach on the north side, installed a decorative stone entrance with iron gates, and sold the first lot in 1988. Nobody, not Winstead, not the HOA he established, not the 109 families who eventually bought homes there, verified who owned the ground the bridge was built on. The bridge sat on the south bank of the creek, on timber company land. When Ridgeview Forestry bought the Tanner parcel in 1996, the bridge came with it. When I bought the parcel from Ridgeview, the bridge came with me. I didn't know any of this when I signed the closing documents. I learned it 3 weeks later when Don Shepard called me on a Saturday morning. "Mitch," he said, "we need to talk about a bridge." Don's voice had that particular quality that lawyers get when they've found something interesting and slightly dangerous. Not alarmed, intrigued. He'd been doing a post-closing review of the title, something he always did as a professional habit, and cross-referencing the deed description with the county GIS overlay. The bridge appeared on the GIS map as Tanner Creek Bridge, private. It was labeled as a feature of the Briarstone Ridge development in the county's land use records, but the actual property lines told a different story. The bridge's south abutment, the deck span, and the north abutment approach, everything up to within 18 feet of the Briarstone Ridge property line, sat entirely on my parcel. Don pulled the original 1952 construction records from the county archive. Howard Tanner had built it, owned it, and never transferred it. When Ridgeview Forestry acquired the land, no easement was recorded. When the developer built Briarstone Ridge, no easement was recorded. The HOA bylaws reference the bridge as community infrastructure maintained by the association. But that was a description of what they did, not what they owned. Don said, "You own the bridge, Mitch. Fee simple, the whole structure." I asked him to repeat it. He repeated it. I told him I needed to think about it. And I did think about it, for about 2 weeks. I drove out to the property every few days, walked the old logging roads, started clearing a spot for a cabin site on the ridge. Each time I passed the bridge, I stopped and looked at it with professional eyes. The steel trusses showed surface corrosion, but no visible section loss. The timber deck had been replaced at some point, probably in the 1990s, with treated lumber that was starting to cup and split. The abutment concrete was original 1952 work, and honestly, it looked better than some bridges I'd inspected that were half its age. Howard Tanner had known what he was doing. The approach slabs, however, were a different story. Somebody, presumably the HOA, had poured asphalt approach pads on both sides at some point, and they were cracking badly. Drainage on the south approach was essentially non-existent. Water was pooling against the base of the south abutment, and had been doing so long enough to leave mineral staining on the concrete. That's how abutments fail. Slowly, then all at once. I hadn't said anything to anyone about the bridge ownership. I was still processing it. And then Karen Delancey showed up. It was a Wednesday morning in late May. I was parked at the south approach, on my property, examining the drainage issue with a tape measure and a notebook. Habits die hard. When the black Lexus appeared from the Briarstone side. She crossed the bridge, pulled up next to my truck, and got out. The clipboard introduction. The threat. The community infrastructure speech. I listened. I didn't argue. I told her my name and that I was the new owner of the Ridgeview parcel. She wrote it down on the clipboard like she was filing a report. "This bridge has been Briarstone property for 35 years, Mr. Holloway. We maintain it. We insure it. We control access to it. If you think you can buy some timberland and start making claims on community infrastructure, you've made a very expensive mistake." I said, "I appreciate you letting me know. Have a good day, Karen." She stared at me for a moment, confused maybe by the lack of resistance, then got back in the Lexus and drove across the bridge to Briarstone Ridge. I finished my drainage assessment, drove home, and called Dawn. "She came to see me," I said. "Did she threaten you?" "Told me they'd bury me in court." Don was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll pull the HOA's recorded documents and the developer's original plat. Let's see exactly what they think they own." What Don found was exactly what I'd expected. Nothing. Paul Winstead's original subdivision plat, filed in 1988, described the Briarstone Ridge development boundaries. It did not include the bridge. The plat showed a road labeled Bridge Approach Road, terminating at the property line, with a notation that said, "Access via existing private bridge, see separate instrument." There was no separate instrument. Don searched the county records going back to 1987 and found no recorded easement, no access agreement, no license, nothing. The developer had simply used the bridge because the timber company didn't object, and then he'd sold 112 lots to families who assumed the access was permanent. For 35 years, 109 occupied homes, 3 had never sold, had relied on a bridge that none of them had a legal right to use. Don drafted a formal ownership notification letter. It was not aggressive. It stated the facts. I was the fee simple owner of the bridge and the land it sat on. No recorded easement existed. I was open to discussing a formal access arrangement. The letter was sent certified mail to the Briarstone Ridge HOA Board of Directors, care of Karen Delancey, President. Her response came 9 days later, not from an attorney, but from Karen herself, on HOA letterhead. It was 3 pages long and accused me of the following: fraudulently claiming ownership of community property, attempting to extort a residential neighborhood, conspiring with the prior landowner to engineer a property dispute, and, this was my favorite, deliberately purchasing land adjacent to Briarstone Ridge with the intention of weaponizing infrastructure access. I had bought 2,400 acres of forest land because I wanted to build a cabin and listen to birds. But according to Karen Delancey, I was a Bond villain. I filed the letter. 2 weeks later, the HOA retained an attorney. His name was Martin Caldwell, and he ran a small firm in Athens that specialized in community association law. He was competent, I'll give him that, and his first move was a smart one. He sent Don a letter formally asserting that the Briarstone Ridge HOA had acquired a prescriptive easement over the bridge through continuous, open, and hostile use for more than 20 years. Don called me. "They're running the prescriptive easement play." "I figured they would," I said, "and you know the problem with it." I did. Prescriptive easement requires hostile use, meaning use without the owner's permission. But the timber company had never objected to the bridge use, not once in 30 years. They'd allowed it. Multiple Briarstone residents had stories about interacting with Ridgeview forestry crews over the years, and being told, essentially, "Sure, use the bridge, we don't care." That's permission. And permission kills a prescriptive easement claim dead. Don found 3 residents willing to confirm this. 2 of them were original buyers from 1989, who remembered Paul Winstead personally telling them that the timber company doesn't mind. A third, a man named Gary Holtzman, had a copy of a 1997 newsletter from the HOA that explicitly referenced the bridge, which Ridgeview Forestry allows the community to use. That newsletter was gold, a written admission that the use was permissive, published by the HOA itself. Don smiled when he read it, which is the only time I've ever seen Don smile while reviewing legal documents. "They wrote the answer on their own letterhead," he said. 1997. Martin Caldwell didn't know about the newsletter yet. We didn't tell him. Karen escalated in June. I use that word specifically because escalated is the polite version of what she actually did. She convened an emergency HOA board meeting and passed a resolution declaring the bridge to be permanent community property by historical right. The resolution had no legal weight whatsoever, but it sounded official, and that was the point. She distributed copies to every household in Briarstone Ridge. She contacted the McMinn County Commissioner's office and demanded that the county designate the bridge as a public road. The county attorney reviewed the property records and told the commissioner's office in writing that the bridge was on private land with no recorded public right-of-way. The county declined to act. She went to the local newspaper. A reporter from the Athens Post-Athenian called me for comment. I gave him a brief, factual statement. I was the legal owner of the bridge. I had the deed and a survey to prove it. I had offered to negotiate a formal access agreement. The HOA had not responded to that offer. Karen's statement to the newspaper was considerably more dramatic. She called me a predatory speculator and said I was holding 109 families hostage. She said the HOA would fight this to the state Supreme Court if necessary. The story ran on a Thursday. By Saturday, my email had 23 messages from Briarstone Ridge residents. 16 were supportive, 4 were threatening. 3 were from people who were clearly confused and just wanted to understand what was happening. One of those confused residents was a woman named Jean Okoro. She was a 30-year Briarstone resident, a retired county clerk, and the kind of person who instinctively distrusts anyone who yells the loudest. She called me that weekend and asked, very politely, if she could see the deed. I said, absolutely. I printed a copy and met her at a coffee shop in Athens. She read it carefully. She knew how to read deeds, having processed thousands of them. And when she finished, she folded her reading glasses and said, "Well, she should have checked." "She didn't," I said. "No," Jean said, "she didn't." Jean became an important ally, not because she agreed with me on everything, she didn't, but because she was honest and calm and had credibility in the neighborhood that Karen Delancey could never touch. Jean had been there since the beginning. People trusted her. Meanwhile, I was getting concerned about the bridge itself. I'd been a structural engineer for 30 years, and I'd been looking at that bridge with increasingly professional unease every time I drove past it. The drainage issue on the south approach was worse than I'd initially assessed. The timber deck, on closer inspection, had rot in at least 3 of the cross members. The steel trusses had surface corrosion I could live with, but one of the gusset plate connections on the upstream side showed what looked like fatigue cracking. I wasn't going to guess. I called a colleague. Dr. Anand Krishnamurthy was the most meticulous bridge inspector I'd ever worked with. We'd overlapped for 8 years at the firm, and he'd since started his own inspection practice. I trusted his judgment completely. I hired him to do a full structural assessment of the Tanner Creek Bridge. He arrived on a Tuesday in July with a 2-person crew, a drone, and a portable ultrasonic testing unit. They spent a full day on the bridge. Anand crawled under the deck on a rope harness, which I found mildly terrifying despite the fact that I'd watched inspectors do this 1,000 times. Something about it being your own bridge changes the feeling. His report came a week later, and it confirmed what I'd feared. The timber deck was structurally deficient. 4 of the 12 primary cross members had rot that reduced their load-bearing capacity by 30 to 40%. The gusset plate I'd noticed was indeed showing fatigue cracking, hairline but present, and consistent with decades of cyclic loading without maintenance. The south abutment had moisture intrusion from the failed drainage, with early-stage erosion of the bearing seat, and the bridge had never been formally load-rated. There was no posted weight limit. There was no inspection history on file with any agency, because it was a private bridge, and nobody had ever required one. Anand's conclusion was blunt. The bridge was not in imminent danger of collapse, but it was operating well below any reasonable safety margin. He estimated the deck would need full replacement within 2 to 3 years, and that a responsible owner should post a 10-ton weight limit immediately, pending repairs. He estimated the total cost of bringing the bridge to current AASHTO standards at $240,000, 10 tons. A standard fire truck weighs between 16 and 30 tons. A loaded school bus is about 15. This was no longer just a property dispute. It was a safety problem, a real one. I called Don. I called Anand. I called Ellie, because she was the person I talked to when things got serious, and she said what she always said. Do the right thing, Dad, but do it smart. Then I thought about Karen Delancey's newsletter from 1997, the one that confirmed the HOA knew the bridge access was permissive. I thought about the HOA's claim that they maintained and insured the bridge. If they'd been maintaining it, where were the inspection records? Where was the maintenance log? If they'd been insuring it, under what authority had they insured a structure they didn't own? I asked Don to send a formal records request to the HOA under the Tennessee Homeowners Association Act, which entitles any affected property owner to request association records relevant to a shared infrastructure dispute. We asked for every maintenance record, inspection report, insurance policy, and expenditure related to the bridge from 1988 to present. The response came 3 weeks later. It was thin. The HOA had spent a total of $14,000 on the bridge in 35 years. That's $400 a year. They had repaved the approach pads twice and painted the guardrails 3 times. There was no structural inspection on file, no maintenance log, no engineering assessment of any kind. The insurance policy they'd referenced covered common area structures, but specifically excluded infrastructure not owned by the association in the fine print. They had been driving 109 families across an uninspected bridge with no load rating for 35 years, while telling those families it was maintained and insured. It was neither. I spread the documents across my kitchen table. Anand's report on one side, the HOA's maintenance records, such as they were, on the other. The gap between what had been done and what should have been done was staggering. I sat there for a long time, looking at it. Then I started writing a plan. August was hot that year, the kind of East Tennessee heat where the humidity wraps around you at 6 in the morning and doesn't let go until after dark. I spent most of the month at the property, clearing land for the cabin site and meeting with Don and Anand by phone every few days. The plan had 3 components. First, the safety piece. I needed to post the bridge with a weight restriction immediately. Anand recommended 10 tons, and I agreed. Under Tennessee law, a private bridge owner has the authority, and arguably the obligation, to post weight limits consistent with the bridge's assessed condition. I wasn't closing the bridge. I was restricting it to vehicles that the structure could safely support. Passenger cars, light trucks, minivans, all fine. School buses, fire trucks, moving vans, construction equipment, not fine. Don drafted the formal notice. It was sent to the HOA Board, the McMinn County Emergency Management Agency, the County School District Transportation Office, and the local fire department. The weight restriction would take effect in 45 days. That fire department notification was important. If a house in Briarstone Ridge caught fire, and the nearest engine couldn't cross the bridge because of a weight restriction, people needed to know that now, so alternate response plans could be arranged. Second, the easement offer. Don and I spent 2 weeks drafting it. The terms were straightforward. Annual easement fee, $15,000 per year, roughly $137 per household per year. The easement would be permanent, recorded, and would run with the land. In exchange, the HOA would be responsible for all bridge maintenance going forward, with inspections every 5 years by a licensed structural engineer. The first obligation under the easement would be the $240,000 structural rehabilitation identified in Anand's report, to be completed within 24 months. I would retain the right to close the bridge for emergency safety repairs if maintenance standards weren't met. $15,000 a year, less than $12 a month per household, for the permanent, recorded, legal right to cross the only bridge to your home. I ran the numbers 3 times because I wanted to be sure I wasn't being unreasonable. I wasn't. Third, the meeting. Under Tennessee HOA law, a capital expenditure exceeding $25,000 requires a vote of the full membership. $240,000 for bridge rehabilitation clearly qualified. Gene Okoro, who understood HOA governance better than anyone on the current board, helped me identify the procedural requirements. 10% of the membership, 12 homeowners, needed to submit a written petition requesting a special meeting. Gene had 13 signatures within a week. Karen Delancey was required by the bylaws to schedule the meeting within 60 days. She scheduled it for October 27th, as far out as the bylaws allowed, presumably to give Martin Caldwell time to find a legal argument that didn't collapse on contact with the 1997 newsletter. I spent September preparing. I built a presentation deck. I printed Anand's report, the deed, the survey, the HOA's own maintenance records, and the 1997 newsletter in bound packets, one for every household. I contacted Anand and asked if he would present his findings in person. He said yes. I also did something I hadn't expected to do. I called the McMinn County Volunteer Fire Department and spoke with the chief, a man named Russell Cartwright. I asked him, hypothetically, what his response protocol would be for a structure fire in Briarstone Ridge if the bridge were weight restricted to 10 tons. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We'd have to stage on your side of the creek and run hose across the bridge on foot. Response time would go from 4 minutes to somewhere between 14 and 22 minutes, depending on conditions." "That's a long time," I said. "Yes, sir," he said. "It is." I asked him if he'd be willing to attend the membership meeting to explain that to the residents. He said he would. October arrived, and Karen made her move. Martin Caldwell filed the lawsuit on October 3rd, 24 days before the membership meeting. The complaint alleged adverse possession and prescriptive easement, claiming the HOA had used the bridge openly, continuously, exclusively, and hostilely for more than 20 years. It sought a declaratory judgment, establishing the HOA as the legal owner of the bridge. Don and I had been expecting this since June. We filed our response in 6 days. Attached to it were 4 sworn declarations. Jean Okoro stated that she had personally interacted with Ridgeview Forestry employees on multiple occasions and had never been told she was trespassing or unwelcome. Gary Holtzman submitted the 1997 newsletter, authenticated by his own sworn statement. 2 other original Briarstone residents confirmed that the developer, Paul Winstead, had explicitly told them the timber company didn't mind the bridge use. And then Don filed the newsletter itself as Exhibit D, the one that said, in the HOA's own words, published to the entire membership, that Ridgeview Forestry allows the community to use the bridge. Permissive use, written, dated, published by the HOA. Adverse possession requires hostile use without the owner's permission. The HOA had publicly acknowledged that they had permission. Their own newsletter destroyed their own legal theory. Martin Caldwell called Don 3 days after we filed the response. Don said the conversation was brief and professional, and that Caldwell sounded like a man who had just realized his client had handed him a grenade with the pin already pulled. But the lawsuit served Karen's real purpose, which was theater. She posted in the Briarstone Ridge private Facebook group. I was getting screenshots from Jean by this point, claiming the lawsuit was progressing strongly and that Martin Caldwell was confident. She told residents the membership meeting on October 27th was unnecessary and potentially harmful to our legal position. She urged people not to attend. Jean Okoro posted a response. It was 3 sentences long. The meeting was petitioned under the bylaws by 13 homeowners. It is legally required. I will be there, and I hope you will too. 47 people liked Jean's post. Karen's post got 9. On October 19th, 8 days before the meeting, someone left a typewritten note under the windshield wiper of my truck, which had been parked at my cabin site. The note said, "Leave Briarstone alone or face the consequences." I didn't know who left it. I photographed the note, the truck, and the surrounding area. I filed a police report with the McMinn County Sheriff's Department. I installed 2 trail cameras on the approach road. I told Ellie about it that night on the phone. She was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Are you safe?" "I'm a 58-year-old man with a deed and a good attorney," I said. "I'm fine." "Dad." "I'm fine, Ellie." The morning of October 27th was cold and clear. First real cold snap of the fall. I drove out early, parked at the cabin site, and walked down to the creek in the dawn light. The water was low and clear, running over limestone ledges with that particular October sound, crisp, unhurried. A red-tailed hawk was working the ridge to the east. I stood there for a while and let the quiet settle into me. Then I got my binders, got in my truck, and drove to the Briarstone Ridge Community Center. The parking lot was full. Jean had told me to expect maybe 50 people. I counted 83 cars. The community center was a stone and timber building near the entrance gate. Nice construction, peaked roof, a patio with built-in grills that nobody used because the HOA had rules about grill smoke. The meeting room had been set up with folding chairs, and people were standing along the back wall. Karen was at the front, behind a long table with Martin Caldwell and 2 other board members. She was dressed formally, dark blazer, pearl earrings, hair freshly done. She had a stack of documents in front of her and a wireless microphone clipped to her lapel. She looked prepared. I came in through the side door with Don, Anand, and Chief Cartwright. Jean met us in the hallway and said, "It's packed. They're nervous." "They should be," I said, "but not about me." The meeting was called to order at 7 o'clock by the board secretary, a young man named Trevor Sims, who clearly wished he'd never volunteered for the position. The agenda had one item: discussion and vote on bridge access and structural rehabilitation. Karen had tried to limit the agenda to legal strategy update, but Jean's petition had specified the actual topic, and the bylaws required it. Karen took the floor first. She spoke for 20 minutes. She was polished, I'll give her that. She framed the situation as an attack on the community by an outside landowner. She said the lawsuit was strong, and that legal experts supported their position. She showed a timeline of bridge use going back to 1988 and said it proved adverse possession. She did not mention the 1997 newsletter. Martin Caldwell spoke next. He was more careful. He outlined the adverse possession argument in general terms and said the case had viable legal theories. He did not say they would win. He was too smart for that. Then Jean Okoro stood up. Under the bylaws, any member has the right to speak during a special meeting called by member petition. I'd like to invite Mr. Holloway to present his information. Karen said, "He's not a member of this HOA." Jean said, "The bylaws allow the petitioning members to invite relevant parties to present at a special meeting. I'm inviting him. It's in section 7.4b. Would you like me to read it?" Karen looked at Martin Caldwell. Caldwell looked at the table. Jean said, "Mr. Holloway." I walked to the front. I set up the projector I'd brought and connected my laptop. I put the deed on screen first. This is the recorded deed for the property I purchased in March of this year. I'm going to show you the legal description, the survey, and the county GIS overlay. You're welcome to follow along in the packets that are being distributed now. Dawn and Jean were passing out the bound packets, 1 per household, 109 copies. I'd had them printed at a shop in Knoxville. I walked through the deed. I showed the survey with the bridge footprint highlighted. I showed the county GIS overlay, confirming the bridge sat entirely on my parcel. I moved slowly. I spoke clearly. I let people read along. Then I said, I'd like to introduce Dr. Anand Krishnamurthy, a licensed structural engineer with 32 years of experience. He inspected the bridge in July. Anand took the projector. He showed photos. He showed the rot in the cross members, the fatigue cracking in the gusset plate, the erosion at the south abutment. He explained what each deficiency meant in plain language. He showed the estimated repair costs. He showed the recommended weight restriction. The room was very quiet. Then I introduced Chief Cartwright. Russell Cartwright stood at the front in his dress uniform, a big man with a deliberate voice and the kind of authority that comes from 30 years of walking into burning buildings. He said, "If that bridge is posted at 10 tons, my trucks can't cross it. The nearest alternate access to Briarstone Ridge adds 14 to 22 minutes to our response time. In a structure fire, that's the difference between saving a house and losing it. In a cardiac event, that can be the difference between life and death." Nobody moved. I walked back to the projector. I put up the easement terms. I went through each one: the annual fee, the repair obligation, the maintenance schedule. $15,000 a year, split among 109 households, is $137 per home per year, $11.42 per month. The structural repair is $240,000. Your reserve fund currently holds $268,000. This is solvable, tonight. Then I said one more thing. I also want to show you something your board published in 1997. I put the newsletter on screen. The relevant sentence was highlighted. Ridgeview Forestry allows the community to use the bridge. I let it sit there. The room read it. The lawsuit your board filed claims you used this bridge hostilely, without the owner's permission. Your own newsletter says the opposite. This document ends the adverse possession claim. Your own board put it in writing 29 years ago. Karen stood up. That newsletter is being taken out of context. The legal strategy. A man in the third row said, "Karen, sit down." She didn't sit down. "This is my meeting, and I..." Gina Coro said, "Karen, sit down." Karen sat down. The vote was called. 89 to 14. The secretary counted twice because Karen demanded it. The second count was 90 to 13. One resident who'd initially voted no changed his mind after looking at the newsletter page in his packet one more time. 90 households voted to accept the easement terms, to authorize the structural repair, to record a permanent easement and end the dispute. Karen stood and said the vote was illegitimate because outside parties had been allowed to influence the proceedings. The secretary said, "The vote followed the bylaws. It's recorded." Karen turned to Martin Caldwell. "File an injunction, tonight." Caldwell closed his briefcase slowly. "Mrs. Delancey, I need to advise you that given the newsletter and the declarations already filed, the adverse possession claim faces material challenges. An injunction to block a membership vote that followed your own bylaws is not something I can recommend in good conscience." "Then I'll find someone who will," she said. Caldwell nodded. "That's your right. I'll send my final invoice this week." There's a particular silence that follows a moment like that. Not triumph, not defeat, something more like pressure equalizing. The room had been holding its breath for months, and now it exhaled. Dale, a retired machinist who'd been in Briarstone since 1991 and had barely spoken all evening, raised his hand from the back of the room. "Mr. Holloway," he said, "thank you for not just closing the bridge." I nodded. That was never the plan. 4 days later, the Briarstone Ridge membership held a follow-up meeting. Karen did not attend. The board recall vote passed 78 to 6. Gina Coro was elected interim president. A retired accountant named Phil Watkins became treasurer. Trevor Sims stayed on as secretary, looking considerably less miserable. The new board contacted Don within the week. The easement agreement was signed on November 19th and recorded in McMinn County on November 22nd. Don and I stood at the Register of Deeds counter while the clerk stamped it. He looked at me and said, "That's that." "That's that," I said. Martin Caldwell filed a motion to dismiss the adverse possession lawsuit the same week. The judge granted it without a hearing. Karen retained a new attorney in December, a litigator from Chattanooga, and filed a personal lawsuit against me, alleging defamation and tortious interference with association governance. Don reviewed it, drafted a response citing Tennessee's anti-SLAPP statute, and sent Karen's attorney a letter explaining that every statement I had made was either a documented fact or a clearly stated opinion, and that pursuing the case would result in fee shifting. The lawsuit was withdrawn in February. The bridge rehabilitation began in March. Anand oversaw the project personally, which he didn't have to do but wanted to. He hired a specialty contractor out of Knoxville, a crew that had worked on historic bridges throughout Appalachia, and understood the difference between preservation and replacement. They replaced the timber deck with steel grating, repaired the gusset plate connections, re-poured the south abutment bearing seat, and installed proper drainage on both approaches. The bridge was closed for 19 days during the most intensive phase. The HOA arranged a temporary shuttle service across a gravel ford 2 miles upstream, Gene's idea, that worked well enough for passenger vehicles. A few residents grumbled, most understood. On the day the bridge reopened, Anand certified it at HS20 load rating, good for any standard vehicle, including fire trucks and school buses. Chief Cartwright drove a truck across it himself, slowly, with the kind of careful satisfaction that people who deal in safety bring to moments when safety is finally established. I was there that morning, standing on the south bank, watching the first cars cross. A woman in a sedan, a utility truck, then a yellow school bus that rumbled across the new steel deck with a sound like low thunder. And I watched it until it disappeared up the road into Briarstone Ridge, carrying somebody's kids to school on a bridge that was finally, properly, safe. With the $15,000 a year coming in from the easement, I did 2 things. First, I established a maintenance endowment through a local community foundation. Half the annual easement income, $7,500 a year, goes into a fund earmarked for bridge inspection and maintenance. When the fund reaches $50,000, the annual contributions will shift to a scholarship for McMinn County students studying engineering or environmental science. The scholarship will be named for Ellie. She argued with me about it for a week. I won because I'm her father, and I'm stubborn. Second, I placed 1,200 acres of the property, the old growth ridge and the creek corridor, into a conservation easement with the Foothills Land Conservancy. No development, no commercial harvesting, just forest and water and wildlife, held in trust permanently. The Conservancy's director called it one of the most significant private conservation actions in McMinn County in a decade. The cabin is done. It's not much. Timber frame, metal roof, a porch that wraps the south and east sides and catches the morning sun. I built most of it myself, with help from a carpenter in Etowah who'd done post and beam work for 40 years and could notch a joint by eye that you'd need a computer to match. The view from the porch takes in the full sweep of the ridge, the creek bend, and on clear mornings, the haze of the Smokies on the eastern horizon. Ellie visited in April. She walked slowly. The MS makes distances harder than they used to be, but she made it to the creek, and she sat on a rock and put her feet in the water and laughed for the first time in months. That sound was worth more than any deed or easement or legal victory I've ever been part of. Gina Coro calls me every few weeks. The new board is running smoothly. The bridge maintenance schedule is on a 5-year inspection cycle. The reserve fund is being managed properly. She says the neighborhood is quieter, and she means it as the highest praise. Karen Delancey sold her house in June and moved to Chattanooga. I heard this from Gene, who heard it from the real estate agent. No forwarding drama. No final confrontation. She just left. I think about her sometimes, not with anger, with something closer to pity. She'd spent years building an identity around control, controlling the neighborhood, controlling the narrative, controlling who could cross a bridge she didn't own. And when the facts came out, all that control evaporated, because it had never been built on anything real. There's a lesson in that, not just for HOA presidents, but for anyone who confuses authority with ownership. You can maintain something, ensure something, control access to something, and talk about something as if it's yours for 35 years. And at the end of it, if your name isn't on the deed, you own nothing. I sit on my porch in the mornings now and drink coffee and watch the hawks work the ridge. The bridge is sound, the creek is clear, the forest is protected, and 109 families can get to work and get home and get their kids to school on a bridge that somebody finally took the time to make safe. I'm good with that. If any of this sounds familiar, if you've dealt with an HOA that treated your property like theirs, or fought a battle you weren't supposed to win, drop your story in the comments below. And if this is your first time here, hit subscribe. I've got more stories where this one came from, and I promise they don't disappoint.
Here's what this story is really about. Karen Delancey spent 9 years running that HOA, and in all that time, she never once did the one thing that would have protected the community she claimed to lead. Check the date. She assumed the bridge was there. The developer assumed it before her. 109 families assumed it because someone told them they could. 35 years of assumption, and not one person walked into the county records office and asked the question, what made your head? And what won this? Wasn't money or connections or aggression. That's what I did. A survey, a structural engineer, a fire chief, and the patience to let the facts speak in the room full of people who needed to hear them. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten, he showed the truth, calmly and completely, and let people make their own decision. And here's the part that mattered the most. The bridge is safe now. 109 families drive across a properly inspected, properly rated, properly maintained structure every day. School buses cross it, fire trucks can cross it. That's not an abstract legal victory. That's the kind of result that actually matters. If you've ever dealt with a neighborhood authority figure who confused being loud with being right, drop your story in the comments below. I want to hear it. And if this is your first time here, hit subscribe, because the next story involves a gated community, a private lake, and a retired hydrologist who discovered the HOA had been building residents for water rights they never legally held. You're not going to want to miss it.